Hi guys. Tonight we step into the aching heart of a medieval village, where the earth has failed you and the harvest has collapsed into silence. The golden fields you once trusted lie barren, stalks thin and withered, their heads offering no promise of bread. You stand among neighbors who stare at the sky, as though one last prayer might summon rain or Sunday. The truth presses down. This year, there will be no bread. The air is tense with the metallic tang of fear, and you probably won't survive this, not without finding something else to chew, something else to keep the spark inside your chest burning. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it in your corner of the world? Now, dim the lights, and imagine the low murmur of your stomach echoing through the hut. The thatched roof drips with cold rain, and a single candle fights the darkness. You know bread is gone, and with it, a sense of security. It was more than food, it was the very measure of life. Without bread, you feel as if your place in this fragile order is unraveling. A mainstream historical fact tells us that in medieval Europe, bread could account for up to 3/4 of a peasant's daily calories. A loaf was not a luxury but the baseline, the unshakable rhythm of every day. Remove that, and you've stripped away both nourishment and ritual. Families measured days not in hours but in how much bread remained. And in famine years, that measure shrank alarmingly. You counted crumbs instead of slices. You sit hunched at the rough-hewn table, watching a neighbor slice the final heel of rye bread, hard as a stone. It smells faintly sour, tinged with mold. The knife screeches against the wood as the wedge is passed around. Children squabble for the tiniest morsel, and you sense the desperation building like storm clouds. There's a hush after the last crumb is eaten, as though everyone is waiting for someone to declare a miracle, but none comes. Historians still argue whether famine was truly universal across the countryside, or whether some communities managed to buffer themselves through hoarding and careful planning. Perhaps a hidden store of oats under a floorboard kept a single family afloat, while others dwindled. Or perhaps wealthier households stretched out stocks by mixing flour with husks or legumes. What remains undisputed, however, is that entire regions faced sharp hunger when weather turned cruel. A quirky tidbit often overlooked. During famine years, some peasants described their bread as black, not because of rye or barley, but because they filled the dough with ground peas, weeds, or even powdered tree bark. Imagine chewing bread that smelled of forest floor, tasting of bitterness, crumbling like sawdust on your tongue. It was bread in name only, and yet it kept you alive another day. You lean back, ribs pressing against your rough wool tunic, wondering how many days can pass before your body begins to betray you. Hunger makes your senses sharper, cruelly so. The faint smell of smoke from the neighbor's hearth feels like a feast. The sight of a stray chicken darting across the yard makes your mouth flood with saliva. Even the sound of rain on the thatch feels heavier, reminding you of ruined wheat fields beaten flat. You trudge through the village, seeing despair carved into every face. The blacksmith no longer hammers, he lacks strength. The children play sluggishly, tossing pebbles instead of running. You hear one woman whisper about mixing sawdust into gruel, another about catching rats. Hunger becomes the only topic, the only thought, the only prayer. Night deepens, and you lie on the straw bed, belly gnawing itself into knots. Your mind drifts to the stories told by elders that hunger reveals true character. Some neighbors grow generous, offering their last onion. Others bolt their doors and watch through cracks as the desperate beg. You wonder where you will fall. Would you share your last loaf? Or guard it like treasure, even from your own kin? In the flicker of your candle you see the shape of the year to come, one without bread, one where every mouthful is an improvisation, an invention born of despair. The fields have failed you, but the story is only beginning. You don't yet know what strange, bitter, or barely edible foods will carry you forward. You only know that survival will demand more than hope. It will demand a stomach hardened to things you never imagined eating. And so, tonight, The story begins, not with abundance, but with absence. The year without bread. You wake the next morning with the same emptiness coiled in your belly, a hollow drumbeat that follows you out the door. The mist lies low over the fields, hiding the stunted stubble of last year's harvest. You walk slowly, head bent, eyes scanning the ground for something, anything that might fill the gnawing ache. In a world without bread, you are forced to look downward, into the soil itself, where roots hide quietly like secrets waiting to be pulled. A mainstream historical fact: root vegetables such as turnips, parsnips, and carrots were the unglamorous backbone of survival for peasants. They did not command feasts or poems, but in times of famine they offered life. These roots, buried deep, were less vulnerable to hail or drought than the exposed heads of grain. You squat in the mud, digging with calloused fingers, tugging at the stubborn greens. Your nails fill with dirt as the knobby body of a parsnip comes free, pale and misshapen, smelling faintly of earth and bitterness. Yet you are grateful. You chew it raw, and the sharp taste jolts your tongue. It is not pleasant, but it silences your hunger for a moment. You picture boiling it later, softening it into a weak broth that will stretch across your family's bowls. The pot will bubble, releasing a steam that smells faintly sweet, though thinner than the rich stews of better years. Historians still debate whether medieval peasants deliberately stored these root vegetables in underground pits through the winter, or whether they scavenged them haphazardly in times of need. Some accounts describe careful cellars dug beneath homes, lined with straw, where turnips kept for months. Others suggest that desperate peasants clawed frozen ground to free whatever remained in the fields, scraping frost from their beards as they dug. Whichever was true, the image remains. Survival hinged on these humble plants. A quirky tidbit emerges when you listen to village gossip. Some peasants believed parsnips grew sweeter if left in the ground until after the first frost. Children would nibble them raw, their breath misting in the cold, giggling at the sudden sugary burst that surprised them. You smile faintly at the memory, even now, when sweetness feels like a faraway dream. The air around you is damp, filled with the smell of wet soil and rotting vegetation. You tug more roots, filling a rough sack. Each one feels heavier than it is because each is a step away from starvation. But even as you gather them, a dread settles in your chest. Roots can carry you through weeks, perhaps months, but not forever. Hunger lingers at the edges, whispering that this is only a pause, not a solution. You notice the neighbors, too, bending low, their cloaks soaked with dew. Some carry crude digging sticks, others use their hands. Everyone pretends not to notice when two villagers lunge for the same swollen turnip. They avert their eyes afterward, ashamed at their own desperation. Hunger strips courtesy quickly. Later, in the smoky interior of your hut, the roots boil in a cracked pot, the fire weak but stubborn. The water turns cloudy, a faint promise of flavor. Children sit close, eyes following every bubble. The smell is faint, earthy, like steam rising from wet fields. You sip the broth, thin as it is, and it warms your belly. For the first time in days, you feel something close to comfort. Still, the thought gnaws at you. Roots alone will not carry you through. You know they are plentiful now, but by spring they will shrivel. The cellar will empty. You will need more. Always more. The famine year has only begun, and already you sense the cunning it will require. You lie down that night with the taste of parsnip still clinging to your teeth, a faint sweetness tucked into your memory like a secret treasure. The hunger is not gone, but it has loosened its grip, if only briefly. Tomorrow you will dig again. Tomorrow you will search deeper. The soil has become your table, and you pray it does not close its hand against you. The frost hardens across the village paths, crunching beneath your worn boots as you wander farther than usual. The roots you clawed from the earth yesterday have already begun to dwindle, and your belly insists on more, so you turn toward the forest's edge, where the tall oaks stretch bare branches against a pale sky. Their presence whispers of something most people only consider when desperation sharpens its teeth. acorns. One firmly documented detail from the period is that peasants often turned to acorns as a last resort in years of famine. Not the sweet chestnuts prized in noble kitchens, but the bitter oak acorns that clattered onto the forest floor. They were abundant, yes, but almost inedible in their raw form. Still, hunger transforms what seems impossible into necessity. You stoop, gathering the hard-shelled nuts into a woven basket, fingers numbing in the cold. The acorns smell faintly tannic, their shells smooth and cold as stones. Back in your hut, you dump them on the table, the sound like a scatter of dice. Cracking them open takes patience. The meat inside is pale and dense. You know the bitterness will bite at your tongue, so you follow the half-remembered advice of your grandmother. Soak them in running water, again and again, to wash away the cruel tannins. You picture the villagers trudging to the riverbank, burlap sacks filled with acorns dangling in the current for days, until the water carries the harshness downstream. The question lingers among experts whether acorns truly became a staple during great famines, or whether they remained a marginal food, remembered only because of their bitterness. Some chroniclers record families baking dark loaves padded with acorn meal, while others dismiss the idea as folklore. What seems certain is that acorns were known, and their preparation was not quick. Time was required, and hunger rarely allowed time. Yet here you sit, determined to try. One curious detail often overlooked is that some peasants believed acorn bread could cause madness if eaten in excess. They whispered that the bitterness seeped into the mind, dulling reason, making men short-tempered or sluggish. Perhaps this was nothing more than the effects of malnutrition itself, but the story carried weight. Children teased one another, saying, "Eat too much and you'll bark like the oak." The soaked acorns, once leached, grind into a coarse paste. You mix them with the thinnest trickle of rye flour left in your pot, shaping rough cakes. The smell rising from the fire is strange, smoky, earthy, and not quite pleasant. Yet when you bite into one, the bitterness is muted, leaving behind a heavy, nutty chew. Your teeth ache from the density. You feel it sink into your belly, not satisfying but anchoring, a ballast against the storm of hunger. Around the village, you see others with the same idea. Women gather with baskets, children trail behind, clutching handfuls of acorns, sometimes popping them into their mouths despite the taste. The faces are grim, but there is also a flicker of resilience. Nature has withheld grain, but she has offered these hard little gifts, and you learn quickly to accept them. Evenings stretch long in the smoky huts. You sit by the low fire, gnawing on acorn cakes, listening to neighbors whisper about years past. They speak of the great famine that once swept the land when whole families perished, and acorns became both curse and savior. Someone insists that a man in a nearby village lived 3 months on nothing but acorns and river water. Another swears such a diet left his hair brittle and his eyes yellow. Stories blur fact with fear, yet each carries the weight of truth. You eat what you must, not what you wish. You close your eyes, chewing slowly, imagining what it must feel like to taste proper wheat bread again, warm from the oven, the crust crackling, the crumbs soft and airy. The contrast is almost unbearable. Hunger sharpens memory, and the phantom of bread haunts you with every bite of acorn. Still, the oak sustains you in its grim fashion, its bitterness a reminder that survival often comes clothed in discomfort. By the time you curl under your thin blanket, your stomach is heavy but restless. The acorns lie in you like stones, demanding energy to digest. You shift and groan, wondering whether you've traded one kind of suffering for another. Yet you remind yourself, you are still alive, and in a famine year, that fact alone is enough to carry into tomorrow. Your hands ache from splitting shells, your jaw sore from chewing bitter bread, yet hunger gnaws with persistence. So, you begin to notice what sprouts stubbornly at the edges of fields, the places where soil meets ditch or hedgerow. Not wheat, not barley, just weeds. They wave in the cold wind, uninvited guests. But in famine, even weeds are welcomed. Records from the time consistently show that peasants turned to wild greens when cupboards emptied. Nettles, sorrel, goosefoot, dandelion, and lamb's quarters all found their way into pots, boiled into thin stews. You tug nettles from the earth, careful to pinch the stem so their sting doesn't flare across your fingers. The leaves, once boiled, lose their bite, softening into something earthy and faintly sweet. Sorrel offers a lemony tang, sharp enough to jolt your tired tongue. Goosefoot, with its dusty leaves, cooks down into a spinach-like paste. They smell grassy, like wet meadows, and steam curls in gentle ribbons as the pot simmers. An unusual footnote from the Chronicles suggests that in some villages, weeds weren't merely tolerated but prized as God's greens. Children were sent to gather them as chores, their baskets filled not with treasure, but with survival. The irony is striking. Plants once cursed for invading gardens became the mainstay when grain failed. You wonder how many curses were replaced by prayers of thanks in years like this. Researchers remain uncertain about how much of these greens could actually sustain a body over weeks or months. Some argue they offered vital vitamins that kept scurvy and weakness at bay, while others doubt their caloric contribution. After all, you can eat a bowl of nettle broth and still feel the pangs gnash again within an hour. Yet the warmth, the smell, and the illusion of a full belly carry their own medicine. One curious oddity passed down in stories is that nettles were thought to cleanse the blood. Villagers joked grimly that if famine didn't kill you, nettles might make you glow with health. Old women muttered charms over boiling pots, believing the leaves chased sickness as well as hunger. You sip the hot broth and imagine for a fleeting second that they might be right. The texture is thin, the taste faintly metallic, but it spreads heat through your chest. You close your eyes and let the steam fog your lashes. It is not bread, not meat, not cheese, but it is something. The children lap it greedily, green streaks on their chins, and you let yourself feel a flicker of relief. For tonight, at least, no one will sleep on an entirely empty stomach. Still, you know weeds are fragile allies. The frost can kill them overnight, and soon the ditches will offer nothing but ice and mud. You imagine spring, when dandelions burst yellow, but spring feels like another lifetime. Right now, you will pluck what survives. You trudge back into the night air, the chill sharp against your skin, stomach faintly warmed. Above you, the stars are brittle points of light, and the silence of the village is heavy. Fires glow weak in huts, their smoke curling like thin fingers. Somewhere, you hear a cough, dry and desperate. Hunger does not strike all at once. It lingers, carving away at people piece by piece. You wonder who will still be here when the weeds vanish and the soil hardens to stone. The smell of nettle still clings to your fingers as you lie down. You pull the cloak tighter, pretending you are full, pretending the hollowness has softened. The truth is harsher, you are merely delaying the emptiness, stretching it across days like thin cloth across a window. Yet even delay can feel like a victory. In a famine year, weeds are more than weeds. They are hope with roots shallow but persistent. And as you drift toward restless sleep, you think, tomorrow, you will search again, eyes sharp for every green thing that dares to live where wheat has failed. The weeds helped you stumble through another day, but they melt away too quickly in the frost. Your eyes begin to notice the rougher textures around you, bark peeling from birch and elm, sawdust swept into corners of the mill. These are things no one would call food in times of plenty, yet hunger alters the imagination. You consider what might be made edible if mixed cleverly with the little flour left. Contemporary accounts make clear that in years of famine, peasants sometimes stretched dough with powdered tree bark or coarse sawdust, creating loaves that were heavier than stone and harder than kindness. Birch bark, scraped thin, could be dried and ground into a greyish powder. Mixed with water, it smelled of smoke and wood smoke resin, faintly bitter but strangely filling. Millers swept up the husks and bran that wealthier customers rejected, bagging them for desperate neighbours who could not afford pure grain. A small but striking oddity is that in some places, Chestnut or pine bark was boiled into a thick glue-like paste, then left to cool into jelly. Children would poke at it, laughing at its wobble before chewing reluctantly. Imagine a dinner where your spoon sticks upright in the bowl, and the taste lingers like damp wood on your tongue. Not nourishing in the truest sense, yet better than nothing. Scholars continue to disagree on how widespread this bark bread really was. Some argue the references are exaggerations, metaphors for hardship rather than culinary fact. Others point to archaeological evidence, charred loaves excavated with fibers of wood still visible. The uncertainty adds to the eerie image. Somewhere, a family sat around a table gnawing at bread that once belonged to the forest itself. You remember the sound of teeth scraping against crust, the way jaws ached afterward. The crumbs did not soften in water, not fully. When baked, the smell was less bread and more like the inside of a carpenter's shed, sawdust baked into heat. You chewed until your gums hurt, and yet the ache in your belly eased slightly. That contradiction was what famine demanded: pain in one place traded for relief in another. Walking through the village, you see other households attempting similar tricks. Thin loaves, dark and strange, are carried carefully from hearth to table. No one speaks with pride of them, but everyone eats. You notice the older folk chew slowly, as though swallowing each bite is an act of willpower. Children complain at first, spitting out the splinters, but hunger bends them quickly. After a few days, even the complaints fade. The smell of bark bread drifts from chimneys in dull waves, a scent that would seem absurd in other times. You imagine what a nobleman might say if he caught wind of such meals: disgust, perhaps, or laughter. Yet you know survival often wears ridiculous masks. You do what you must, and you pray your body can digest the unthinkable. At night, lying on straw, you feel the roughness in your gut. Bark scratches from the inside, leaving you queasy. You clutch your belly, torn between relief and unease. Was it worth it? You ask yourself in the dark, while wind rattles the shutters. The answer is always the same: it must be. You drift into uneasy sleep, lips tasting faintly of ash and bitterness. The forest has become your pantry, the sawdust your flour. Tomorrow, you will scrape again, hands steady, hoping the trees forgive you for chewing their skin. The morning frost stiffens your cloak as you step outside, but today you do not walk toward the forest. Instead, your feet carry you toward the barn, where the cows shift restlessly, their warm breath clouding in the cold air. Hunger has taught you to glance not only at fields and hedgerows, but also at the beasts that graze beside you. Milk, curds, and cheese, these humble gifts of animals become lifelines when bread vanishes. Chronicles from the era emphasize how vital dairy was in lean years. Even when grain failed, a cow still produced milk, though less in winter. That milk could be stretched, boiled into thin porridge, churned into butter, or left to sour and curdle, producing lumps that slid into broth. Coarse wheels of cheese, often cracked or mold-spotted, lingered in cellars long after meat spoiled. You draw a pail beneath the cow, your hands stiff on the teats, and the warm stream splashes, smelling faintly sweet and grassy. One curious detail often ignored is that whey, the watery byproduct of cheesemaking, was never wasted. Peasants drank it straight, poured it over stale crusts, or simmered it into soups. Thin and sour, it filled bellies when nothing else remained. Children wrinkled their noses, but mothers coaxed them with soft promises: it will keep you alive. Even pigs drank it, but in famine years, humans lowered their standards to match. Academic circles remain divided over whether dairy truly provided enough calories for survival in the harshest years. Some argue the yield per cow was too meager once winter set in, while others note that even a trickle of milk could tip the scale between weakness and endurance. In your hut, you cradle a clay cup of warm milk, watching steam curl like ghosts. You sip slowly, savoring the fat clinging to your lips, imagining for a moment that comfort still exists. A small but memorable oddity surfaces in village gossip. Peasants sometimes grated hard cheese rinds directly into boiling water, creating a broth that tasted faintly of animal and salt. The rind itself was so tough you could barely chew it, but it flavored the liquid just enough to trick the senses into believing a feast had occurred. You catch yourself grinning at the memory of gnawing on a cheese heel like a dog with a bone, content despite the absurdity. You barter with a neighbor for a lump of curdled cheese, its surface cracked like parched earth. In better years you might have turned it away, disgusted by its smell of sour hay and damp cellar. Now you slice it carefully, sharing it out in wafer-thin pieces. The children close their eyes as they chew, as though imagining it richer than it island. You watch their cheeks hollow and their hands shake, but you also see the faint spark of satisfaction, the spark that tells you another day has been won. By candlelight, you hear stories of monasteries that kept vast stores of cheese, round wheels stacked high in cool stone rooms. Some monasteries shared freely, handing out small chunks at their gates, while others guarded their stores fiercely, convinced that charity would empty their coffers. Villagers tell of pilgrims who travelled miles to stand in line for a crumb of holy cheese, their lips mumbling prayers as if dairy were divine. You picture the queue, faces drawn and eyes fixed on a door, waiting for the chance at nourishment blessed by monks. You curl beneath your blanket that night, with the faint tang of curds still lingering on your tongue. Your body warms from the fat, a comfort greater than weeds or bark. Yet the gnawing truth returns. A cow cannot feed the whole village, nor can a handful of cheese stretch across months. The famine year is long, and milk will thin before spring. Still, as you drift into uneasy dreams, you remind yourself that survival is made of small victories. Tonight, cheese has carried you. Tomorrow, who knows what strange salvation will appear. The fire sputters low in the hearth, shadows trembling against the soot-stained walls. Your belly rumbles again, not from emptiness alone but from the thinness of yesterday's meal. Dairy softened the edge of hunger, yet it never stayed long. So you turn to what has always been the peasant's fallback: pottage. Not the rich stews of nobles, thick with meat and spice, but the watery cauldrons that bubble endlessly in cottages, catching whatever scraps happen to fall in. Chroniclers frequently note that the perpetual pot was the most common form of sustenance across medieval Europe. A single pot often hung over the fire day and night, never emptied, simply topped up with water and new ingredients. A turnip one day, a handful of beans the next, a bone gnawed nearly clean dropped in for flavour. The broth grew darker, cloudier, stranger with each addition. You ladle it into wooden bowls, steam curling against your chilled face. It smells of earth, smoke, and faint sweetness, but never quite enough to satisfy. One unusual observation in surviving recipe fragments is that pottage was sometimes stretched with handfuls of straw or hay, not for nutrition, but to thicken the liquid and fool the mouth into believing it chewed substance. Imagine gnawing on softened stalks, swallowing fibers that scratch all the way down. People laughed at the absurdity, but laughter came with full mouths or as close to full as they could manage. The scholarly community remains divided about how effective pottage truly was at sustaining life during famine years. Some argue it delivered crucial calories by combining legumes, fats, and grains in small amounts. Others suggest it was more psychological, a ritual of eating together that kept despair from taking root too quickly. After all, a steaming bowl shared by family, no matter how thin, warmed more than the stomach. A curious anecdote tells of villagers dropping pebbles into the pot, not to eat, of course, but to weigh it down so the broth seemed more plentiful. Children were told the stones gave strength, and they would clink their teeth on them before laughing nervously. The ritual mattered as much as the liquid itself, a trick of hope disguised as supper. Tonight, you stir your own pot with a rough wooden spoon. The broth is thin, tinted green from nettles, dotted with lumps of parsnip and a sliver of cheese rind. The smell is humble but comforting, and the act of stirring feels ancient, connecting you to countless hands that did the same in centuries past. You taste cautiously, the liquid scalds your tongue at first, then leaves behind an earthy tang. You close your eyes, pretending the flavor is fuller, thicker, richer than it island. The children slurp noisily, exaggerating their delight. You know they do it partly for your sake, to ease your heart. You watch them lick their bowls clean, fingers chasing the last streaks of broth. Their eyes glisten not with satisfaction, but with determination, and you marvel at the resilience hunger breeds. As the night deepens, neighbors drift in with small offerings, a handful of beans, a cracked onion, a strip of dried fish skin. Each contribution drops into the cauldron with a hiss, and the aroma shifts again. There is a quiet solidarity in the circle around the fire. Hunger isolates, but pottage draws together, weaving thin strands of community where famine threatens to unravel it all. You fall asleep with the smell of smoke and broth clinging to your hair, belly faintly warmed. Outside, frost coats the hedges silver. Inside, the pot still simmers, low and steady, waiting to receive whatever scraps tomorrow may offer. Survival, you realize, is not always about abundance. It is about keeping something, anything, bubbling through the night. The forest looms at the edge of your world, a tangle of bare branches, damp earth, and the whisper of creatures unseen. Hunger drives you there, away from the tilled fields that have failed you, into the wild where food hides in shadows. You push past brambles, the chill of morning dew soaking through your cloak, and your eyes sweep the ground with new intent. This is not a stroll of curiosity, it is foraging, and it may mean the difference between life and collapse. Medieval records make plain that peasants often turned to the woods for sustenance during famine years. Hazelnuts, wild berries, mushrooms, even chestnuts in some regions all became prized discoveries. You kneel by a hazel thicket, fingers trembling as you search for the hard little nuts hidden under leaves. They smell faintly woody when cracked, their kernels small but dense with oil. You pop one into your mouth, crunching through the earthy shell, and though it barely touches the hunger, it gives your spirit a flicker of relief. An unusual note preserved in local folklore tells how children were sent into the forest armed with baskets, not only to gather berries and nuts, but to scare away birds that competed for them. Some villagers tied small bells to the children's waists, so the constant jingling echoed through the undergrowth. The forest became a symphony of desperation, metal and laughter ringing out against the hush of trees. You imagine the noise, half play and half survival. There is no consensus among scholars about the safety of mushrooms in medieval diets. Some sources insist that villagers could distinguish the edible from the poisonous with remarkable skill, while others believe mistakes claimed countless lives. You crouch now at the base of an oak, staring at the pale caps clustered like teeth. Do you dare? Your grandmother's voice echoes. Red ones kill, white ones deceive. Still, your stomach twists, and your hand hovers closer. The risk is real, yet hunger mocks hesitation. One odd story clings to your mind. A man once boasted of surviving an entire season on nothing but boiled nettles and mushrooms, yet the villagers swore he grew shorter by the end of winter, as though the forest had shrunk him. Perhaps they only meant his cheeks hollowed, his back stooped, but the image lingers, a caution and a joke at once. You gather what you can: nuts, a handful of berries lingering on thorny vines, and a few mushrooms you think might be safe. The basket feels light, but it rattles with promise. As you return through the forest, the air is thick with the smell of wet leaves, and every rustle makes you glance over your shoulder. Hunger dulls fear, but it never quite erases it. Back in the hut, you roast hazelnuts over the fire, their shells cracking sharply, scenting the air with a faint sweetness. The children lean close, eyes wide, as if a feast has returned to the table. You stew the berries into a thin mash, their sourness sharp but refreshing against your tongue. The mushrooms you boil thoroughly, praying your caution was enough. The broth smells earthy, dark, like damp soil warmed by fire. You sip slowly, tasting both life and danger in every swallow. As the night deepens, you reflect on how the forest feeds you differently than the fields. Grain is predictable, measured in sheaves and sacks. The woods are fickle, offering bounty one day and emptiness the next. Yet here, in famine, unpredictability feels like hope. Each walk into the trees might bring disaster, or it might bring a handful of hazelnuts that carry you through another day. You settle onto your straw bed, belly lined with nuts and berries, the faint dizziness of mushrooms humming in your veins. Your body is still hungry, but it is no longer desperate. The forest has whispered its reluctant mercy. Tomorrow you will return again, stepping quietly under the branches, ears pricked for birds, eyes scanning for the next miracle hidden beneath leaves. The forest, with its berries and nuts, gave you a reprieve, but tonight the hut feels emptier again. The fire flickers weakly, and your belly coils in protest. You begin to hear talk in whispers, almost shameful, of foods no one would consider unless driven by famine. Lowly creatures that crawl, creep, or slither, things scorned in good times, now eyed with reluctant hunger. Medieval chronicles occasionally mention that peasants resorted to eating creatures regarded as unclean or laughable. Snails plucked from garden walls, frogs scooped from muddy ditches, starfish washed up on northern shores. It was survival stripped of dignity, a reminder that when grain failed, the line between food and filth blurred. You picture yourself crouching by a damp wall, prying snails from stone, the shells cool and slimy in your hands. One peculiar anecdote preserved in monastic notes describes villagers boiling snails with garlic and herbs if they were fortunate enough to have them. The broth, thick with slime, was said to slide easily down the throat. Children gagged at first but learned quickly not to complain. The oddity lingers in your imagination. Hunger transforms disgust into nourishment, and you wonder how your own mouth would manage such a meal. There is still debate among food historians about how widespread such diets became. Some argue they were confined to the poorest, desperate hamlets, while others believe whole regions turned to insects, snails, and other overlooked creatures. Evidence remains patchy, for few would boast of these meals in records meant for posterity. Yet the very silence is telling. It suggests shame, not absence. One curious story passes through the village like smoke. A fisherman's wife who lived on the coast claimed she roasted starfish over embers, their spiny shells crackling, the inside tasting faintly of iodine and ash. Neighbors laughed at her madness, but in the end, they admitted she lived through the famine when many stronger folk perished. You roll this tale on your tongue like a stone, wondering how far you might go when pressed. You try your own hand at gathering snails. The night is damp, and their trails glisten silver along the stones. You pick them carefully, dropping them into a clay pot, the tapping sound like pebbles. The smell is faintly earthy, like moss after rain. Back home, you boil them until their bodies slip free, slick and pale. The first taste makes your stomach clench, but the second goes down easier, and by the third, you barely notice. Hunger has trained your senses to yield. The children watch with wide eyes, faces twisted in half disgust, half curiosity. You coax them gently, telling them the snails are just forest meat. They chew reluctantly, swallowing with grimaces, but soon they too are quiet, their small bellies stilled for now. You look at them and feel a strange mix of sorrow and pride. They are learning too early what you hoped they would never need to know. Outside, the village is hushed, but you sense the same experiments happening in other huts. A faint smell of boiled frogs drifts from a neighbor's chimney. A child whispers of beetles roasted on a flat stone. You realize famine is not only a test of endurance but also of imagination. The land still offers food, if you are willing to lower your pride and your expectations. Lying down that night, the taste of snails lingers. Not unpleasant, not pleasant, simply there, a reminder etched into your tongue. Your belly is steadier, your body less hollow. Yet your mind circles the same question. What else lies in the margins of possibility? How much lower will you bend to keep living? The famine year is teaching you that survival is not noble, not clean, not glorious. It is crawling, creeping, chewing what once disgusted you, and rising again to do it tomorrow. The snails eased your hunger for a night, but they offered little strength. By morning your limbs feel heavy, and your thoughts drag like stones. You look beyond weeds and roots, beyond insects and bark, and your eyes turn toward the slow-moving streams that cut through the village. The water glimmers faintly under the weak winter sun, and you realize the riverbed hides creatures far richer than snails. Fish. Accounts from the period consistently mention that peasants leaned heavily on rivers and ponds during times of famine. Eels, minnows, carp, and even crayfish were coaxed from the water with cunning tools. Fishing was not always permitted. Lords often claimed rights over certain waters, but desperation dulled obedience. You gather willow branches and weave them into a crude basket, its shape narrowing like a funnel. Dropped into the shallows, it becomes a trap. You wait, shivering, until the wriggling begins. One curious record describes eel hunting as almost a ritual. Peasants marched into marshes barefoot at night, feeling for the slick bodies with their toes. The sensation was so unnerving that even hardened men shuddered, yet the prize was worth it. Fatty, rich flesh that filled stomachs longer than any nettle stew. You imagine yourself wading through black water, heart pounding as something living slithers beneath your feet. Scholars remain divided on how reliable fishing was in famine years. Some point out that overfishing quickly emptied streams near villages, leaving families wandering miles for a catch. Others believe ponds and rivers were carefully managed, providing lifelines precisely because peasants knew their limits. Whatever the truth, you now pull your trap from the water, and inside a small carp flaps wildly, scales glistening silver like coins in the sunday. An unusual tidbit tucked into folklore tells of peasants who believed eels carried the souls of the dead. To eat one was to invite ghostly whispers into your dreams. Yet in hunger, superstition bends. You gut the fish carefully with a dull knife, the smell of river mud thick in your nostrils. The flesh is pale, flaking under heat, and when you place it on your tongue, the flavor is almost overwhelming, oily, rich, and savory in a way you had nearly forgotten. The children gape, their mouths shiny with grease, chewing greedily. For a brief moment the hut feels festive, as though a holiday feast has returned. You close your eyes, savoring the heat of protein spreading through your chest. The fish is not only food but memory, the memory of better days when the river's catch was a supplement, not salvation. Outside, other villagers gather at the banks. Some kneel with spears, others craft lines with hooks of bent wire. The air fills with laughter and frustration, curses when a fish slips away, cheers when one is caught. For the first time in weeks, the village feels alive, as though hunger has driven everyone into a common hunt. Smoke begins to rise from chimneys, carrying the unmistakable scent of fish roasting over coals. Night falls, and you sit back, belly heavier than usual. Yet in the quiet, you wonder how long the river can sustain so many. What will happen when the fish are gone, when nets come back empty? Hunger teaches you to savor each victory without trusting it to last. Still, you fall asleep with the taste of river fat clinging to your lips, dreaming of streams that never run dry. The fish gave you strength, but strength is dangerous when mixed with desperation. With it comes a restless boldness, and soon you hear whispers of choices far riskier than rooting for weeds or dangling traps in the river. The forest teems with larger prey, deer, boar, hare, but these creatures are not yours to claim. The law is as clear as the sky is cold. Game belongs to the Lord, not to the peasant. To hunt without leave is to court punishment, sometimes the gallows. Yet famine blurs the line between crime and survival. One firmly recorded detail from the period is that poaching was widespread in years of scarcity. Forest laws forbade peasants from snaring or spearing deer, yet countless men slipped into the trees at dusk with crude boughs, risking everything for meat. The flesh of a single stag could keep a family alive for weeks, and the temptation was irresistible. You imagine yourself moving silently beneath the canopy, every twig a betrayer underfoot, heart hammering in your ears. An unusual chronicle from the 13th century describes how some villagers disguised themselves as monks to poach more safely, chanting prayers aloud while carrying crossbows under their cloaks. The oddity almost makes you laugh. It paints a picture of men half holy, half hungry, gambling salvation for venison. Would you dare such a trick if it meant a hot meal? Researchers remain uncertain about how often peasants were caught and punished. Some documents show brutal sentences, blinding, mutilation, even death, while others suggest lords sometimes looked the other way, knowing too many bodies in the fields weakened their own wealth. Perhaps both were true, depending on the lord's mood and the season. That uncertainty sharpens the tension as you stand in the dark forest, listening for the crack of a branch, wondering if it belongs to a deer or a guard. A curious tale circulates in your village. A man once snared a young boar and fed his entire street for a week, yet he was betrayed by the greasy smoke drifting from his chimney. The lord's men dragged him away, and the villagers whispered that his last words were worth remembering. Better to die with meat in my belly than live gnawing bark. His story lingers like a warning, and a dare at once. You crouch by a deer path now, clutching a sharpened stick. The forest smells of moss and damp bark. Every sound magnified: the distant hoot of an owl, the shuffle of leaves. When at last the animal appears, antlers like dark branches, your breath catches. It is beauty and salvation wrapped together. Your arm trembles, courage fighting terror. Do you strike? You know the cost if caught, yet your ribs ache with emptiness. In the end, you let the stag pass, watching its shadow dissolve into the trees. Hunger still gnaws, but fear bites harder. You trudge home with only sticks for company, heart pounding. Tonight, you will chew roots again, perhaps stretch flour with husks. But the image of the deer haunts you, a reminder that survival sometimes hides behind forbidden doors, doors that only the desperate dare to open. You lie on your straw bed, torn between relief at your caution and regret at your restraint. Sleep comes slowly, filled with visions of venison roasts you never tasted. Hunger, you realize, is not only about emptiness, it is about choices you are forced to make. Choices that carve your soul as sharply as they carve your stomach. The stag you spared still lingers in your mind, its shadow stalking your thoughts long after the forest swallowed it. Hunger sharpens your ears, and you begin to notice smaller sounds in the hedgerows, the flutter of wings, the frantic rustle of tiny bodies. Large animals might be too dangerous to chase, but birds, lowly, plentiful, often overlooked, become the next target of your starving imagination. Medieval records remind us that peasants frequently trapped small birds during famine years. Sparrows, pigeons, starlings, rooks, creatures that once annoyed farmers by stealing grain, suddenly became prizes. You wander along the edge of a field, eyes scanning the hedges where a cloud of sparrows darts in and out. You hold a simple snare made of string and a bent twig. Set carefully, it is baited with crumbs no larger than your fingernail. Hunger teaches patience. You crouch in the frost, waiting for wings to settle. A curious note preserved in a 14th century manorial roll mentions fines levied against villagers who stole the lord's pigeons. Imagine being punished for plucking a bird you once considered vermin. Yet pigeons were fattened in dovecotes for the nobility, their droppings prized as fertilizer. To steal one was theft not just of food but of privilege. Still, desperation has little respect for privilege. Scholars remain divided over how much nutrition these small catches truly offered. One pigeon barely fills a pot, and a sparrow hardly more than a mouthful. Yet the rich oils of bird flesh, the dark meat and marrow, could sustain more than a bundle of weeds ever would. Was it enough to keep whole families alive? Or did such catches serve more as psychological victories, moments of triumph that gave people courage to endure? The debate lingers like the smoke of a half-extinguished fire. One unusual anecdote that surfaces in folklore is that children often became the best bird catchers. Too small to wield ploughs, too light to snap branches, they spent hours creeping near hedges, flinging nets or stones with startling accuracy. In some tales, they even mimicked bird calls, drawing their prey closer with whistles and chirps. The village might mock them in better years, but during famine they became celebrated hunters. You picture a thin child returning with 2 sparrows tied to a belt, grinning proudly as though carrying a stag. You try your own hand at it. Hours pass before your trap snaps shut, and the sudden flutter makes your heart leap. A pigeon struggles inside, wings thrashing against twigs. You approach quickly, hands steady despite the guilt that stirs. The bird smells of feathers and dust, warm life thrumming in its body. You end it quickly, whispering an apology no one hears. Back in your hut, you pluck the feathers by the fire. They float like snow, sticking to your skin, catching in the smoky air. When the bird roasts on the spit, the hut fills with a scent you almost forgot, rich, savory, unmistakably meat. The children crowd close, eyes wide as coins, their hunger sharp, but their excitement sharper. The skin crisps, blistering with fat, the crackle echoing through the silence. When you finally carve it, the meat barely stretches across the bowls, but every bite feels like wealth. The flavor is deep, smoky, tinged with salt rubbed from the last precious pinch in your pouch. As you chew, you realize how much of survival is measured in moments of taste. A pigeon today might mean weeds tomorrow, bark the next, but tonight, your tongue remembers joy. The bird is gone quickly, bones sucked clean, marrow scraped with tongues. Yet the warmth it leaves in your chest lingers long into the night. Later, lying on your straw bed, you hear wings flutter in the rafters. A sparrow trapped inside the hut beats against the dark. Your stomach tightens again, but you smile faintly. Not every bird must be eaten. Some will sing you to sleep. The pigeon feast fades into memory as quickly as smoke from the hearth, leaving behind both strength and a sharper awareness of what else might be eaten. When famine stretches too long, the boundaries of food blur even further, creeping into shadows most would rather avoid. Whispers ripple through the village, whispers of meals so taboo that people lower their voices, glancing over shoulders before speaking. You hear them at the well, muttered in shame. Dogs, cats, even crows. Chroniclers of the period occasionally recorded such dark recourses, often with horror. Dogs, long companions of hearth and hunt, were sometimes slaughtered when grain failed and livestock had already vanished. Cats, guardians of barns and keepers of mice, found themselves eyed with hunger rather than affection. Crows, black scavengers of battlefields, became food for the starving, roasted over flames despite the oily bitterness of their flesh. These accounts remind you that famine strips away sentiment as surely as it strips flesh from bone. One odd detail that survives in folklore is that people sometimes justified eating dogs by saying they were closer to pork than beef. The phrase unsettles you, but you understand the need for such fictions. In a world where loyalty and companionship are luxuries, the line between pet and meal blurs. Children wept when their dogs disappeared, but mothers reminded them that grief does not fill a belly. Academics remain uncertain how widespread such practices were. Some argue they were desperate exceptions, rare enough to shock chroniclers into recording them. Others suggest the silence in records hides their frequency, that people avoided writing of it out of shame. After all, who would admit to roasting the family hound or snapping the neck of a barn cat? Silence can bury truth as effectively as soil. A strange anecdote drifts through your mind. An old man once claimed he ate a crow every day for a fortnight, but he insisted he could hear them mocking him afterward. He swore their caws grew louder near his hut, as though the birds knew and were telling tales. Whether true or not, the story makes you shiver, caught between laughter and dread. Your own hut feels different now as you glance at the dog curled by the hearth, ribs showing under his shaggy coat. He lifts his head, trusting eyes meeting yours, tail thumping weakly. Your chest aches with guilt for even thinking it, but hunger pushes thoughts where love resists. You shake your head, stroking his fur, whispering, "Not yet." Still, the thought lingers, heavy as lead. That night, You hear a commotion in the lane. A neighbor has slaughtered his cat, and the smell of roasting meat drifts on the wind. Children argue in hushed voices, some horrified, others curious. You pull your cloak tighter, shutting the shutters to block the scent. Yet the smoke sneaks in anyway, mingling with your own hunger until sleep will not come. When at last you drift into uneasy dreams, you see shadows of animals flickering across your walls, dogs with pleading eyes, cats hissing, crows circling overhead. Hunger twists even dreams into cruel parables. You wake at dawn, unsettled, but alive. The famine year is teaching you that survival is not about choices you want to make. It is about choices you hope you never will. The dog still lies by your hearth, ribs visible beneath his matted fur, and you force yourself to look away. Love is tested most cruelly when hunger sharpens its claws. Yet even as you resist one unthinkable path, another opens beneath your feet. You begin to notice the crawling life in the soil, the beetles that scurry, the worms that writhe after rain, the grubs that burrow into rotting wood. In another season you would shudder or stomp them out. Now, your gaze lingers differently. Documents from certain monastic gardens mention that peasants scavenged insects during lean years, though such notes are often written with disdain. Beetles roasted on flat stones, worms boiled until pale and soft, crickets fried in animal fat if any could be spared. These small creatures provided protein, though never in amounts that felt like feasting. You kneel in the damp soil, fingers digging, the smell of earth thick in your nostrils, until you lift a handful of wriggling worms. Your stomach clenches with disgust, but the gnawing emptiness urges you onward. An odd footnote in folklore claims that some villagers fed children beetle grubs hidden inside bread dough, hoping the little ones would not notice. The grubs added fat, softening the loaf, though the crunch sometimes betrayed the secret. Children cried when they discovered the trick, but mothers reminded them that tears filled no bellies. You imagine your own hands kneading such dough, whispering apologies with every press. Experts continue to disagree about whether eating insects was common across Europe or confined to isolated communities. Evidence is scarce bones preserve in the soil, but insect shells often vanish. Some scholars argue the practice was a rarity. Others believe silence conceals what was too shameful to record. The uncertainty lingers like the faint hum of wings in the night. One curious tale told around smoky fires is of a boy who claimed to eat spiders for strength. He said their webs gave him the swiftness of flies, and he would laugh as he dangled them from sticks before swallowing. Neighbors shook their heads, but when the boy grew tall and wiry despite famine, some began to wonder if he was right. You turn the story over in your mind as you hold a beetle between your fingers, its legs scratching faintly against your skin. Back in your hut, you drop worms into boiling water. They curl and whiten, releasing a smell faintly like fish, but earthier, heavier. The children gag when you offer them, but hunger breaks their resistance. They chew slowly, faces twisting, yet after the first swallow their eyes soften. It is not pleasure, but it is sustenance. You try a beetle roasted on the hearthstone, the shell cracking like thin bone, the flavor nutty and strange. It lingers on your tongue, bitter but tolerable. The hut is silent as you all eat, broken only by the crackle of fire and the faint crunch of shells. When the pot is empty, you sit back, belly no longer hollow but restless. Your body buzzes faintly, as though the crawling life you swallowed still stirs within. Sleep comes uneasily, filled with dreams of writhing soil and buzzing wings. Yet when dawn breaks, you rise with strength you did not expect. Disgust has its price, but so does survival. The famine year is teaching you that pride can be swallowed as surely as beetles, and that the earth, however cruel, will always offer something if you are willing to stoop low enough. The taste of roasted beetles still lingers on your tongue, sharp and bitter, but your body thanks you in its quiet way. Strength creeps back into your limbs, enough to haul water, enough to gather wood. Yet survival in a famine is never secure. The smallest crack in your defenses can widen into disaster, and soon you are reminded that food is not the only necessity. Preservation itself becomes a battlefield. In ordinary years, salt was the peasant's most trusted ally. It dried meat, kept fish from spoiling, flavored soups when everything else was bland. But in a famine year, salt grew scarce, hoarded by lords and merchants, priced so high that you could barely dream of it. Contemporary accounts make clear that salt shortages often turned manageable hunger into lethal crisis. Without salt, what little meat you had rotted faster, what fish you caught spoiled in a day, and your body craved the missing mineral like a lover absent from your bed. An odd entry in a guild ledger notes that some villagers tried to stretch their salt by mixing it with ashes. It fooled the tongue for a while, but it gave food a bitter, acrid taste, and many who tried it gave up in disgust. You imagine sprinkling such a mixture over fish, the smoky grit scratching at your teeth, a parody of flavor more than a remedy. Still, some did it. Hunger twists the rules of the table. Historians continue to debate how often salt wagons actually reached desperate villages. Some chronicles describe relief carts escorted by guards, the salt rationed like treasure. Others suggest merchants exploited famine, selling at ruinous prices to those who would give anything for a pinch. The truth is likely both. Salt as salvation, salt as extortion, salt as the difference between a meal and a rotting heap. A curious tidbit in folklore tells of villagers who licked sweat-stained clothes to taste the salt their bodies shed. It sounds absurd, even grotesque, but it reveals the depth of craving. Without salt, muscles cramped, energy drained, thoughts dulled. You picture a weary man chewing the rim of his hatband, drawing from it the ghost of a mineral that once flowed freely in soups and stews. You open your own cellar, where a small crock of salt once stood, now nearly empty. Just a crust clings to the sides, hardened like stone. You scrape it with a knife, gathering the powder as carefully as gold dust. Tonight you will scatter it over roots and nettle stew, and the flavor will bloom on your tongue like memory sharp, essential, reminding you of a world where food was seasoned rather than endured. The children cheer at the faint sparkle of salt in their bowls. Their smiles slice your heart because you know it will not last. Already the pot is nearly bare, and the nearest market is too far, the price too high. You lie awake, thinking of salt as if it were bread itself, imagining the sting of it on your lips, the way it carries flavor like a river carries boats. By dawn, the reality presses down again. Without salt, preservation fails. The fish you catch cannot be stored. The scraps of meat, rare as they are, spoil before they can be shared. The famine is not only hunger but decay, a rot that spreads faster than you can chase it away. You clutch your knife, scrape one last pinch of white crystals from the jar, and whisper a prayer you never thought you would say for salt, that simplest of gifts. Your salt jar stands nearly empty, but hunger doesn't pause while you mourn it. You rise groggy, stomach groaning, and step into the chill air. The river still murmurs nearby. The fields lie barren, yet something else calls your attention. The barrel where ale once foamed and bubbled. Drink, after all, carries its own kind of sustenance. One well-documented truth from the Middle Ages is that peasants drank ale or small beer daily, often more than water. Not because they sought merriment, but because weakly brewed beer carried calories, B vitamins, and safer hydration than questionable wells. Even children drank it, thin and sour, barely alcoholic but filling enough to count as food when food failed. You lift a jug now, the liquid pale and cloudy, smelling faintly of yeast and straw. It is no feast, yet your mouth waters. A curious footnote in brewing history tells how households recycled brewing dregs until flavor vanished. The first brew, strong and hearty, went to those with means. The second, weaker, stayed with the brewer's family. The third or even fourth barely colored the water, yet peasants drank it gratefully, calling it small beer. Imagine sipping something so weak it feels like ghost water. yet knowing it might be the only thing between you and collapse. There is no consensus among scholars about how heavily famine villages leaned on brewing. Some argue that ale became the backbone of survival. Its grains stretched further than bread could manage. Others note that famine often destroyed barley harvests too, leaving the drink scarce or sour. What remains certain is that every drop was guarded, shared, and treasured. You cradle your jug with reverence, swallowing slowly, feeling the faint warmth spread through your chest. One unusual story preserved in folklore describes villagers brewing beer with oats, peas, or even mashed turnips when barley was gone. The taste was described as sour enough to curl the tongue, yet still considered precious. Children laughed at the bitterness, puckering their lips, but they drank anyway. You picture such a brew bubbling in your own cracked barrel, strange and pungent, yet alive. You pour the cloudy ale into wooden cups, handing them round. The children sip, faces wrinkling at first, then settling into contentment. The drink is thin, but it soothes. Your body hums faintly, as though reminded of better years when ale was more than medicine. The fire glows warmer, your voice softer. Stories slip easier from your tongue. Even hunger seems quieter after a few gulps, dulled by the gentle haze. Night deepens. Outside, frost stiffens the earth, but inside the hut you feel steadier. Your belly may still be hollow, but the drink blunts the ache. You lean back against the wall, watching the last of the foam slide down your cup, and you think, perhaps survival is not always about chewing. Sometimes, it is about swallowing hope in liquid form, no matter how weak. When you finally lie on the straw bed, the faint buzz of yeast still lingers, and your body relaxes for the first time in days. The famine has taken bread, salt, meat, and comfort, but for tonight it has not taken ale. The jug of ale soothed you, but its warmth faded quickly, leaving your stomach restless once more. By dawn, your belly growls with a new insistence, and you turn toward the rough sacks piled in the corner. They once held precious grain, but now only dust remains: husks, chaff, the coarse sweepings from the mill. In better times, animals would have eaten this. Now, you find yourself staring at it as if it were treasure. Chroniclers of the time often remarked that during famine years, peasants lived on bran alone, not the soft interior of wheat, but the gritty outer shell, ground fine or coarse. It was bitter, fibrous, and difficult to digest, yet it offered something to chew, something to quiet the emptiness. You scoop a handful now, the particles rough against your palm, smelling faintly of dust and straw. You know what must be done: boil it into gruel. An unusual note in monastic cookbooks mentions that bran gruel was sometimes flavored with onions or leeks when available, though most of the time it remained plain, a grey sludge that filled the bowl but not the heart. Some monks praised its humility, calling it food for the soul as well as the body. You cannot help but smile wryly at that your soul feels no holier after eating such slop. Academic voices remain divided about how nourishing bran truly was. Some argue it provided bulk but little energy, leaving the starving even weaker. Others claim its fiber offered a strange benefit, slowing hunger and keeping bowels moving when richer foods vanished. Whatever the truth, you pour water into the pot, sprinkle the bran, and stir as it thickens into something between paste and soup. A curious anecdote from peasant folklore insists that the first spoonful of bran gruel should always be given to the oldest in the household, for they know best how to endure bitterness. You glance at your own children and wonder whether this was simply a polite fiction, a way to hide the fact that the elderly often received the smallest portions. Still, you ladle out a bowl for the oldest neighbor who has joined you tonight. He swallows slowly, his eyes closed, as though savoring something finer. The taste when you sip it is harsh, gritty between your teeth, the texture closer to mud than porridge. It clings to your tongue, and the smell is faintly musty, like damp hay. Yet as it slides into your belly, the sharp pangs dull. You glance around the room, Children eat silently, scraping their bowls, eyes lowered. No one complains. Complaints waste energy. As night falls, the pot sits nearly empty, its sides crusted with brown residue. You scrape it clean with a stick, unwilling to waste even a smear. Hunger has taught you to respect even dust. Lying back on the straw, you think of bread, the bread that once defined your days, now replaced by husks. Bran gruel is a shadow of bread, a ghost of grain. Yet it has carried you through another night. You close your eyes, grit still between your teeth, and whisper, thanks not for abundance, but for survival in its most meager disguise. The memory of gritty bran lingers like sand on your teeth, but hunger presses you past disgust. In famine, you find yourself staring at objects once thought useless, even absurd. Tonight, your gaze lingers on the old harness hanging by the door, the cracked leather stiff with age. You touch it hesitantly. Could even this be eaten? The question would have seemed madness in another year. Now, it feels like possibility. Medieval accounts occasionally record peasants boiling leather during the harshest famines. Shoes, belts, harnesses, anything tanned and tough were softened in pots for hours, even days, until the fibers surrendered into something chewable. The broth was thin and bitter, but it held traces of protein and fat. Chronicles of the Great Famine of 1315-17 mention families gnawing on boot soles, the smell of wet hide filling their huts. You stare at your own boots and wonder how many more weeks before you make that choice. One curious detail that emerges from old diaries is that boiling leather often released the smell of smoke and dung, a reminder of the tanning process. Some swore it left their huts reeking for days. Others insisted the odor faded into the background once hunger did its work. You wrinkle your nose even as you imagine the pot simmering, hide softening, broth darkening into a liquid that might be swallowed. The scholarly community remains divided on whether boiled leather provided genuine sustenance or merely illusion. Some argue it gave enough protein to keep a person alive. Others suggest it was nothing but desperation masquerading as food, prolonging suffering rather than easing it. Still, the fact remains, people tried, because to try was better than to starve quietly. A peculiar anecdote tells of a knight's horse bridle stolen not for its gold fittings but for the leather itself. Villagers boiled it into a stew and afterward claimed they could feel the strength of the beast in their veins. Whether truth or superstition, the story travelled, becoming half comfort, half jest. You think of it now, gripping your own harness, whispering, perhaps it carries the strength of oxen. You place strips of leather in the pot, cover them with water, and set them above the weak fire. Hours pass. The smell rises, acrid and smoky, making the children gag. But when you finally ladle the broth, it is dark, oily in patches, almost meaty in appearance. You chew a softened strip. It resists, then yields, rubbery and sour. The broth itself tastes like ashes soaked in rain. You swallow with effort, but the ache in your belly eases. That is enough. The children sip reluctantly, noses wrinkled, but they finish their bowls. Silence hangs heavy afterward, not satisfaction but resignation. This too is food now. You scrape the pot clean, your fingers greasy with the strange residue. Hunger has rewritten the definition of a meal. That night you lie awake, stomach churning faintly. The broth sits uneasily inside you, but it holds you upright, breathing, waiting for another dawn. The famine year teaches you that survival sometimes means chewing the very straps that once pulled your plough, swallowing the skin of your own labor. You close your eyes, and the taste of leather clings stubbornly, a reminder that nothing in your world is safe from hunger's demand. The taste of leather still sits like a ghost on your tongue, but hunger gives you no time for revulsion. Another dawn breaks, pale and grey, and you find yourself staring not at the forest, not at the field, but at the faces around you. Hunger is not just about what you can scavenge, it is also about what you can bargain. In famine, food becomes currency, and currency becomes whatever scraps of value you can muster. One well-attested reality from medieval life is that peasants bartered constantly, but famine turned barter into desperation. A day of labor might be traded for a bowl of gruel. A woolen cloak could be exchanged for a handful of peas. Even dignity became a coin in circulation. You recall stories of neighbors mending roofs or carrying water all day, rewarded not with coins but with half a loaf. Tonight, you weigh the worth of your own strength, wondering how many hours of toil might purchase a turnip. A curious note survives in court records describing how gossip itself became a form of trade. Information who had flour hidden, who had a pig in secret, who might lend a pot of ale was passed like coin. Some gave such knowledge freely, others demanded payment in kind. Imagine selling a rumor about your neighbor's cellar in exchange for a sip of broth. You shudder, but, you know, famine bends morality until it snaps. There is still disagreement among scholars over how far barter systems replaced coinage in crisis years. Some argue that famine sharpened reliance on local exchange. Others insist that markets limped on even in scarcity, with coins clinking weakly though their value shrank. The evidence is scattered, much like the hunger itself, never uniform, always shifting. But one truth stands clear. The poor had to trade whatever they still possessed, even if it was themselves. A peculiar anecdote lingers from folklore. A widow traded her comb of polished bone for a sack of beans. When her hair grew wild and tangled, villagers teased her, but she replied, "Better to live with knots than to die with braids." Her words echoed long after, a proverb born from hunger's cruel humor. You repeat it under your breath now, fingering the simple knife at your belt, wondering whether it too might soon be worth a meal. You find yourself bartering labor for scraps. You carry buckets for a neighbor too weak to fetch water. In return, he shares a crust hardened nearly to stone. You chew slowly, each bite echoing like a bargain sealed. Another day, you sweep ashes from a hearth, rewarded with a thin ladle of broth. The broth tastes mostly of smoke, but it warms your belly nonetheless. Dignity frays quickly. You overhear whispers of women offering more than labor in exchange for food. Their voices are low, their eyes downcast, but the rumors spread. Hunger is not only about bodies wasting, it is about choices forced upon them. You feel the weight of it in your bones, the knowledge that everything can be bought, everything can be sold, if the price is measured in survival. That night, you share your small winnings with the children, who chew noisily, unaware of the bargains you struck to bring food home. You watch them eat and tell yourself it was worth it. Every blister on your palms, every ache in your back. Yet you also know tomorrow you will have to trade again, and the pool of what you own shrinks with each bargain. As you curl beneath your cloak, you realize famine is not only about foraging or boiling bark, it is also about navigating a new marketplace, one where value slips and shifts like sand. Labor, tools, gossip, even pride all are weighed on hunger's scale. And the scale, you know, is never fair. The barter games leave you weary, but they also sharpen your awareness of who truly holds power in a famine. As your stomach groans once more, you hear rumors spreading like smoke. The abbey's granaries still hold sacks of grain. Behind stone walls and wooden gates, monks guard cellars filled with barley, oats, and rye. Some say the stores are for charity, others whisper they are for the monks alone. Hunger twists these whispers into temptation. Contemporary records describe monasteries as both lifelines and fortresses during famine years. On holy days, some abbeys opened their gates, handing out loaves or thin bowls of pottage to the starving who gathered at the doors. Yet just as often those same gates stayed shut, guarded by brothers who feared the desperate crowds might overwhelm them. You stand at the edge of the road now, watching a line form at the abbey's entrance, faces gaunt, eyes hollow. The smell of bread drifts faintly from within, enough to make your jaw ache with longing. A curious entry in a parish chronicle tells of villagers sneaking into monastery fields at night to glean stray ears of grain. They whispered prayers even as they stole, hoping divine ears might forgive theft when it was done with trembling hands. Some were caught and whipped publicly, a cruel irony when the same monks preached mercy. You think of these stories as you glance at the abbey wall, its stones cold and unyielding, its doors bolted tight. Researchers remain uncertain whether monastic charity truly alleviated famine or merely softened its edges. Some evidence suggests monks shared generously, even emptying their own stores, while other accounts accuse them of hoarding and selling at high prices. The truth is likely mixed. Some abbots acted with kindness, others with calculation. From the outside, however, perception is all that matters. To the starving, every locked gate feels like betrayal. One peculiar tale circulates among your neighbours. A group of peasants once stormed a granary, pulling down the heavy doors with ropes and axes. Inside, they found barrels of grain sealed with wax, untouched while children died. They ate handfuls raw, choking on the husks, before the guards arrived. The punishment was swift, 2 men hanged, others maimed, but the story lived on, passed in whispers, fueling resentment. You wonder if the same fate could come to your own village if patience finally snapped. You join the line at the abbey door. The crowd presses close, the air filled with coughs and murmurs. A monk appears, robes grey, his hands pale against the wood of the door. He lifts a basket and begins to hand out pieces of bread, small, hard, barely more than a mouthful each. Yet when your turn comes, you clutch yours with reverence, as though it were relic rather than ration. The bread smells faintly sour, the crust tough, but it is bread, real bread, not weeds or bark. You eat slowly, savouring every bite, each crumb dissolving like memory on your tongue. As night falls, you sit by your hearth, replaying the sight of the locked granary doors. The monks spoke of God's mercy, yet the image of heavy barrels remains burned into your mind. You tell yourself to be grateful for the crust in your belly, but bitterness lingers. Hunger is not only an emptiness, it is also a question whispered in the dark. Why do some feast while others scrape bark from trees? You lie down, the taste of sour bread still faint on your lips. For a brief moment you feel both blessed and betrayed, grateful for crumbs yet haunted by the thought of barrels hidden behind stone. The famine year has taught you that salvation can be locked behind gates, and that the difference between charity and cruelty may be no more than the turn of a key. The abbey's crust carried you through the night, but the memory of closed gates and sealed barrels still gnaws at you. Hunger makes you notice not only what is hidden, but also what is handed out in public squares. This morning you hear the bells ring, calling villagers to the churchyard. Whispers pass quickly. Alms will be given today. You join the crowd, pressing close to the doors where smoke from incense drifts into the cold air, mixing strangely with the sharper scent of bread. Medieval records are clear that famine often brought the poor to church steps. Clergy urged the wealthy to donate grain or loaves as charity, and sometimes the parish itself distributed alms to those waiting. You find yourself in that line now, your breath clouding as you shuffle forward. The priest raises a hand, muttering prayers as he hands out tiny portions, stale bread, peas, sometimes just a ladle of broth. Each gift is paired with a reminder that suffering is a test, that patience and faith will be rewarded. One curious note in parish accounts is that alms were often given in public rather than private. This ensured that those who gave were seen by all, their generosity praised openly. Yet it also meant humiliation for the hungry, who stood exposed, marked as needy before neighbours. You feel that sting as you stretch out your hand, the priest's eyes scanning your face, as though weighing both your hunger and your worth. Researchers remain divided on whether these alms truly saved lives or merely prolonged them. Some argue that church charity prevented widespread collapse, offering just enough to keep villages alive. Others believe the gifts were symbolic, too small to matter beyond a single day. The truth seems tangled. A crust here, a ladle there, never enough, but sometimes just enough. An odd piece of folklore lingers in your mind. It was said that bread given at the church door carried more blessing than bread baked at home. Mothers would save even a crumb to mix into later loaves, believing the sacred trace multiplied nourishment. You pocket a crust of your own, not daring to eat it all at once. Perhaps superstition, perhaps faith, but in famine, you take comfort where you can. You watch the crowd disperse, some weeping with gratitude, others muttering with resentment. One man clutches his bread like treasure, another tears into it before leaving the churchyard. A woman kneels to thank the priest, while a child nearby stuffs the crust into a pocket, perhaps to share later, perhaps to hoard. Hunger reveals not only weakness but also a spectrum of human response. Some turn humble, others defiant, others still quietly cunning. That night, you soak your alms bread in thin broth, letting it swell and soften. The smell is faint but comforting, the taste richer for being sanctified by ritual. The children eat quietly, eyes closing as though savoring a feast. You chew slowly, imagining that each bite carries a sliver of hope along with flour. When you lie down, the memory of the line still flickers, faces hollow, hands stretched, prayers mingling with sighs. The church gave enough to keep you alive, but not enough to silence the hunger. And so you drift into sleep with gratitude on your lips and bitterness in your heart, torn between blessing and burden. The famine year has taught you that survival often arrives not as a banquet, but as crumbs pressed into your palm beneath a priest's solemn gaze. The memory of alms still lingers on your tongue, but your mind drifts elsewhere to the manor hall, where torches burn bright and laughter rises above the cold. You imagine long tables covered with silver dishes, the clatter of knives against roasted meat, the gleam of pies and sweet confections. In the famine year, contrasts sharpen cruelly, and the gulf between your bowl of weeds and their banquet feels like another form of hunger. Documents from the period describe how nobles continued to feast, even in times of scarcity. Imports, stored reserves, and sheer wealth insulated them from empty fields. Almonds, sugar, and spices, luxuries unseen by peasants, appeared on noble tables as though famine were only a rumor. You picture marchpane, an almond confection, molded into towers and castles, glazed until it gleamed like ivory. To peasants, almonds were dreams. To lords, they were decorations. An unusual tidbit surfaces in a 15th century household account. Nobles sometimes fed their hunting dogs bread richer than anything peasants saw in a famine year. The irony stings. Your children gnaw at bark loaves, while greyhounds feast on white wheat. Such records survive not because they shocked contemporaries, but because they were routine. You imagine yourself peering through the hall's high window, smelling roasted meat while your belly twists. Academics remain divided over how the poor perceived these feasts. Some argue peasants resented them deeply, sparking riots and thefts. Others suggest people accepted them as the natural order, even taking pride in their lord's splendor. Perhaps both were true, admiration tangled with fury, resignation with envy. Hunger rarely speaks with one voice. One curious anecdote whispers through folklore. A peasant invited to serve at a noble feast once licked the grease from trenchers after the meal, hiding the scraps in his cloak. He was caught, whipped, yet later boasted that even pain could not erase the memory of sweetness on his tongue. His tale spread like legend, half warning, half fantasy. You think of him now as you imagine the lords slicing into marchpane castles while you stir another pot of nettle soup. Back in your hut, you glance at your own fire, a few embers, a cracked pot. You nibble a crust from yesterday's alms and try not to think of banquets. Yet hunger sharpens imagination, and sometimes imagination is worse than emptiness. You close your eyes and taste roasted goose, almond paste, cinnamon dusted on tarts. The flavors are ghosts, but ghosts can torment as cruelly as absence. That night, you whisper to yourself that famine is not only about what you lack, but about what others keep. Envy becomes another kind of hunger, one that gnaws at pride more than stomach. You roll over on your straw, clutching your cloak, and remind yourself, the lords may have marchpane, but you have endured another day. And endurance, in famine, is its own kind of feast. The images of almond marchpanes and noble banquets haunt you long after the fire has died. Yet even in famine, the rhythm of the calendar continues. Feast days arrive, holy days return, and with them comes the expectation of celebration. The irony cuts deep. You are told to rejoice, to honor tradition, while your stomach howls and your hands tremble with weakness. Still, the village clings to ritual, because to abandon it would feel like surrendering the last thread of normal life. Contemporary accounts remind us that medieval communities celebrated festivals even in years of want, though the tables looked meagre compared to times of plenty. Candlemas, Easter, midsummer these days still demanded gathering. Families scraped together whatever they could, a crust saved for weeks, a turnip hidden beneath straw, a cup of ale stretched thinner than ever. Villagers sang and prayed, voices hoarse, yet the ritual itself fed them in ways bread could not. One odd note from a parish chronicle describes a famine-year Easter feast, where the lamb served was in fact sculpted from parsnip, shaped carefully to mimic meat. Children laughed, half delighted, half confused, while adults chewed in silence, pretending for a moment that ritual had been preserved. You imagine your own neighbors carving a lump of root with solemnity, blessing it as though it were the finest roast. Researchers remain divided over whether these ritual feasts strengthened morale or deepened despair. Some argue they offered vital unity, keeping spirits alive. Others suggest they sharpened hunger, reminding peasants of abundance lost. The truth may lie between ritual was both balm and wound. You feel it yourself as you stir nettle pottage, calling it a festival stew because it is eaten on a saint's day. The children clap hands, smiling faintly, though their bowls are no fuller than yesterday's. A curious tale lingers in oral tradition. During a midsummer famine feast, villagers danced around a fire with empty bowls, banging them with spoons to mimic music. Outsiders thought it mockery, but the villagers claimed it was a charm to summon abundance. Whether charm or jest, the ritual gave laughter, and laughter was as precious as grain. That night, you sit by the fire as the villagers gather to sing. Voices are thin, cracked by hunger, yet they weave together into something strong. For a moment, the air hums with life, not despair. You sway with the song, eyes closed, letting it carry you. The bowl in your lap may hold only broth, but your spirit feels briefly fed. As you lie down afterward, you realize the paradox. Famine strips food away, but not ritual. Even hollow feasts still shape the year, still remind you that life continues. You drift to sleep thinking of the parsnip lamb, the empty bowl dance, the brittle laughter. Hunger may hollow the body, but tradition keeps the soul tethered. The midsummer songs still echo faintly in your ears, but the joy of ritual fades quickly when you return to the reality of your hut. The bowls are still too light, the pot still too thin, and the gnawing inside your belly never loosens its grip. Hunger forces not only innovation, but also cruel arithmetic. When there is not enough for everyone, decisions must be made, decisions that cut deeper than any knife. Records from famine years reveal a harsh truth. Families often rationed food by age and strength. The working adults, those who could labor in fields or barter in markets, received larger shares, while the youngest and the oldest were quietly given less. It was not spoken openly, but it was practiced in silence, an act of survival disguised as necessity. You notice it in your own household. Your spoon pauses before a child's bowl. The ladle lingers longer over your own. Your heart twists, but your hand does not stop. An unusual detail preserved in folklore speaks of hunger hierarchies within families. Children old enough to work were fed better than toddlers, who were considered less likely to survive. Elders often volunteered to eat less, muttering, "Better the young live than the old linger." Some even slipped their portions to grandchildren in the dark, a quiet sacrifice that left them weaker each dawn. You recall the old woman down the lane who gave away her bread heel yesterday. This morning, she could not rise from her straw bed. Scholars remain uncertain how deliberate these sacrifices were. Some argue they were conscious strategies, cold calculations in desperate times. Others suggest they happened naturally, the frail unable to fight for food, the strong surviving by sheer instinct. The debate lingers, but the result is undeniable. Famine thinned families unevenly, sparing some, claiming others. One peculiar anecdote tells of a village where elders gathered in the churchyard and agreed to halve their rations so children might eat more. They called themselves the fasting saints, though no canonization ever came. Their gesture became legend, retold as both noble and tragic. You imagine the sight of grey heads bowed, empty bowls at their feet, hunger worn as a crown of sacrifice. You see it in your own hut. The oldest among you pushes his bowl away, pretending he has no appetite. The children seize the chance, dipping their spoons eagerly. You protest weakly, but he silences you with a look, eyes steady, lips thin. The fire crackles, the broth simmers, and the silence grows heavy. Hunger is cruel not only because it empties bellies, but because it forces love to bend under its weight. That night, you lie awake, listening to shallow breathing near the hearth. You know tomorrow he will eat even less, and the next day less still. Love can give away food, but it cannot give away survival. The famine year has taught you that endurance sometimes demands sacrifices that leave scars deeper than hunger ever could. You close your eyes, the guilt pressing heavier than any emptiness, and you whisper into the dark, "Forgive me." The old man's quiet sacrifice still lingers in your mind as you wake to another grey morning. Hunger has become more than an emptiness in the body. It now feels like a fog in the mind, a weight pressing on your spirit. When food is gone, people turn not only to roots and bark, but also to forces unseen. Belief itself becomes a kind of nourishment. Parish records and folk tales alike reveal that in famine years, superstition flourished. People carried herbs in pockets, muttered charms before eating, or hung amulets above doors to keep hunger at bay. You see neighbors tying bunches of garlic and juniper above their thresholds, the smoke from dried sage curling through their huts as if it might drive famine out like an unwelcome spirit. You catch yourself whispering a rhyme your grandmother taught you: sting of nettle, bite of thorn, carry hunger far from home. The words taste strange on your tongue, yet you cling to them. One curious detail from medieval superstition is the belief that certain stones could protect against starvation. Quartz, worn in a pouch, was thought to strengthen the body. Mothers sometimes gave smooth river stones to children, instructing them to suck on them when hunger grew unbearable. The saliva mingled with minerals, fooling the body into thinking it had eaten. You watch a child now, lips wrapped around a pebble, eyes closed in fragile concentration. Researchers remain divided on how sincerely people believed these charms worked. Some argue they were desperate inventions to give meaning to suffering. Others suggest they carried psychosomatic power, easing hunger through comfort alone. Whatever the truth, faith can quiet the belly, if only briefly. You feel it yourself as you trace a small cross into the dirt before lifting your spoon, as though sanctifying the thin broth into something more. An odd anecdote recorded in village lore tells of a woman who swore she could ward off famine by sprinkling powdered mouse bones into her family's stew. The ritual, she claimed, tricked hunger spirits into believing the family had already been fed. Whether anyone believed her fully or simply clung to the idea, her story spread from hearth to hearth, repeated in tones half fearful, half amused. You sit in your hut that night, watching shadows flicker on the wall. A sprig of rosemary hangs above the door, brittle and dry. Your stomach is no fuller, but your heart feels steadier, anchored by the small illusion of protection. The children whisper charms before sleep, their voices soft, almost musical. You close your eyes, letting their words wash over you like a lullaby. As the fire dies, you realize famine does not strip away belief, it deepens it. When the fields fail, when bread disappears, when bodies weaken, people cling to anything that promises control. Herbs, stones, prayers, whispered rhymes, they become as vital as food itself. You drift into uneasy dreams, the scent of sage still in your nose, the rhythm of charms echoing in your ears. The rosemary sprig still dangles above your door, brittle and scentless. But superstition alone cannot still the ache in your stomach. As winter deepens, whispers grow darker. They no longer speak of charms or nettles or even snails. Instead, in hushed tones, neighbors mutter of the one path. No one dares name aloud the path of eating what should never be eaten. Contemporary chronicles of the Great Famine of 1315-17 contain scattered, dreadful notes, rumors of cannibalism, whispered confessions, accusations made in courts. Some entries are vague, others chillingly precise. Monks wrote of travelers who vanished on the roads, of children left unguarded who never returned. These stories spread like smoke, impossible to prove yet impossible to ignore. You hear the murmurs now in your own village, carried on trembling lips. An unusual anecdote survives from French folklore. A mother who baked bread shaped like a child's body, claiming it tricked her hunger into sparing her own son. Neighbors swore she was mad, yet also swore she survived the winter stronger than most. Was her loaf only rye and bark, or something darker? The ambiguity kept the story alive for generations, retold as both warning and legend. The scholarly world remains divided over how widespread such acts truly were. Some historians argue they were rare outliers, exaggerated by chroniclers eager to moralize famine. Others believe silence in records conceals how common it became when survival pressed against the final wall. The debate itself mirrors the fear. No one wants to believe, yet no one can deny the possibility. One peculiar story passes through your village. A traveller swore that in a town to the north, bread was baked with flour cut by ashes, and perhaps with something else. He would not finish his sentence, but his eyes told enough. The villagers around him fell silent, some crossing themselves, others shaking their heads in denial. You remember that silence now, heavy as a stone. You sit in your hut, children sleeping nearby, their ribs rising like fragile fences against thin skin. The thought creeps in unbidden. What if it comes to that? You shake your head violently, ashamed. But the famine teaches you that every boundary you swore unbreakable begins to bend. You stroke the dog's rough fur, the children's hollow cheeks, whispering, "Not this, not ever." Yet hunger is patient, waiting, whispering that never is only another word for not yet. That night, sleep comes slowly. In dreams you see feasts where the meat is nameless, the laughter hollow, the bread dark and strange. You wake shivering, clutching your chest, praying silently that your village never sinks so low. But as you listen to the coughs and whimpers of neighbors drifting through thin walls, you know why such whispers endure. Famine starves not only the body, it starves the mind, until even horror begins to look like mercy. The nightmare of nameless feasts fades slowly from your mind, but the hunger that spawned it does not. By now the famine has dragged on so long that the village feels hollowed out, its people shadows of themselves. Whispers of cannibalism still coil through alleys like smoke, but most cling to another path leaving. When the soil yields nothing, when cellars echo empty, some decide that survival might be found only on the road. Medieval chronicles describe waves of wandering during great famines. Families abandoned their cottages, trudging toward towns where grain markets still flickered, or toward monasteries rumored to keep stores. They carried little bundles of clothes, a pot, a child clutched tightly, roads filled with the weary, the sick, and the desperate. You imagine yourself stepping onto that muddy path, the smell of damp earth and sweat mingling with the faint hope of bread. One curious note in parish records observes that migrants often sang as they walked, not songs of joy, but laments half prayer, half dirge. The rhythm of song gave tired legs purpose, carrying people mile after mile. You can almost hear it now, a low chant rising and falling, echoing across the fields, each voice trembling but determined. Scholars remain divided on whether wandering actually improved survival chances. Some argue cities provided markets, arms, and the protection of walls. Others insist cities became death traps, crowded with disease and overwhelmed by newcomers. Perhaps both were true. For some, migration meant salvation. For others, ruin. You weigh this in your heart as you glance at your children, wondering if their chances are better on the road or in the cold hut you call home. An unusual anecdote preserved in northern folklore tells of a village that marched together, all at once, abandoning their land entirely. They called themselves God's pilgrims, convinced that leaving was a holy act. Where they ended is unknown. Their story dissolves into rumor. Some say they reached a monastery and were taken in. Others claim they vanished into the forests, swallowed by silence. The tale is retold with equal parts, admiration and dread. You take a step beyond the village edge one morning, just to test the thought. The frost crunches underfoot, and the horizon seems impossibly wide. The air smells of wood smoke from distant cottages, and for a moment you taste freedom. Yet your legs falter. Where would you go? What would you carry? The thought of wandering fills you with both hope and terror. Back in the hut, neighbors discuss leaving. Some swear they will head toward the nearest market town, others toward the sea, where fish still swim. Arguments rise, voices sharp, before fading into exhausted silence. No one has enough strength to fight, not even for decisions that mean life or death. That night, you dream of roads lined with figures trudging endlessly, faces gaunt, eyes fixed on horizons that never come closer. You wake to the same horizon outside your door. Perhaps you will walk it tomorrow, perhaps never. The famine year has taught you that even movement itself can be a form of survival, and even staying put can feel like surrender. The thought of leaving lingers in your mind, but even those who wander depend on forces larger than themselves. Hunger does not exist in silence. It draws the attention of rulers, councils, kings, and in famine years, proclamations spread like smoke through the villages. Today, a rider passes down the lane, his horse thin but his voice loud, unrolling a scroll edged with wax. You and your neighbors gather, weak but curious, to hear what power intends to do about your empty bellies. Historical records confirm that medieval governments often issued decrees in response to famine. Some set price caps on grain, forbidding bakers and merchants from charging more than a fixed sum. Others threatened punishment for hoarding, ordering hidden stores to be surrendered. In rare cases, carts of grain were dispatched from one region to another, guarded by soldiers against hungry crowds. The rider now declares, "By order of the crown, the price of bread shall not exceed 4 pence the loaf." The villagers murmur, half relieved, half skeptical. A peculiar entry in a 14th century town record describes how such caps sometimes backfired. Bakers, unwilling to sell at low prices, simply stopped baking. Loaves vanished from stalls, and the markets emptied even faster. People starved not because they couldn't afford bread, but because no bread was offered. You imagine your own market square, stalls bare, merchants shrugging as they closed their shutters. What use is a law if no food exists to sell? Researchers disagree on whether grain relief was ever fairly distributed. Some argue wagons of barley and rye reached villages and saved lives. Others claim the carts were diverted to cities, or seized by lords before peasants ever saw them. The truth, as always, seems tangled. Some families received relief, others only rumors. You think of the cart tracks you once saw on the road, and wonder if they led to a hungry town or a noble storeroom. One curious anecdote preserved in oral tradition tells of villagers who overturned a relief wagon, seizing sacks of grain before guards could stop them. They were beaten back, but not before scattering enough kernels into the mud that children scraped them up for days. Mothers boiled muddy barley, washing it again and again, still grateful for what the road had spilled. Hunger makes scavengers of everyone. Back in your hut, you discuss the proclamation with neighbors. Some believe the crown will save them, others sneer that kings care only for cities and castles. You sit silently, torn between fragile hope and deep cynicism. The memory of bark loaves and snail broth is too fresh to trust in parchment promises. As night falls, the words of the rider still echo. Price caps, punishments, decrees. You lie on your straw bed, wondering if tomorrow will bring carts of grain or nothing at all. Hunger has taught you this. Proclamations do not fill bowls. Yet you cling faintly to the thought that somewhere, someone with power has noticed your emptiness. Whether that notice is salvation or cruelty remains to be seen. The rider's proclamation fades into memory, but what lingers louder are the sounds of the village itself. Hunger does not silence people, it gives them new songs, strange laments that cling like shadows. You hear them first at night, drifting through the narrow lanes, thin voices singing verses about empty fields, hollow bellies, prayers turned bitter. In famine years, words become another form of sustenance, stories carried on melodies when food is gone. Chroniclers of the 14th century sometimes recorded these famine songs, scribbled in margins of manuscripts or noted by monks. They were not hymns of triumph, but of survival, verses that named the ache directly. No bread in the mill, no meat in the pan. One refrain went, repeated until it felt like both lament and lullaby. You imagine yourself humming it under your breath, the rhythm steady as footsteps, the words a shield against despair. One curious detail from village lore is that children often turned famine into rhyme games. They skipped stones while chanting about nettle soup, or teased each other with songs about bark bread. Their laughter mingled with hunger, creating a dissonant music that unsettled adults but comforted the young. Even misery, it seems, could be wrapped in play. You watch children now, clapping hands in rhythm, their cheeks hollow yet their eyes briefly bright. Scholars continue to debate the role of these famine songs. Some argue they served as oral records, preserving memory of hardship for future generations. Others believe they were coping tools, giving voice to what could not be endured in silence. The lack of written music leaves uncertainty, but the persistence of such rhymes in folklore centuries later suggests they mattered deeply. An odd anecdote passed down in northern tales tells of a village that sang so loudly during famine that passing merchants mistook them for celebrating. Shamed, the merchants opened their wagons, sharing grain with those who had tricked them with false joy. Whether the story is true or not, it carries a strange lesson. Sometimes performance feeds the body as much as the spirit. You find yourself humming one of the laments now as you stir the evening pot. The words slip easily into your throat, carrying the ache out with them. The children join, their voices fragile but determined, filling the hut with a kind of fragile harmony. The broth may be thin, but the sound feels thick, as though each note adds weight to the meal. That night, lying on straw, you still hear the faint echoes of neighbors singing in the distance. The hunger is not gone, but it feels less lonely when it has a melody. You close your eyes, chest rising and falling in rhythm with the unseen choir. Famine, you realize, starves the body, but not always the voice. In song, you taste a kind of survival that grain alone cannot give. The songs linger in the night air, fading only when dawn breaks pale and thin. By now, the famine year has carved itself into your bones. Every day has been measured in roots and weeds, bark bread and snail broth, alms and whispers, dreams and despair. And yet, like all winters, this one must finally yield. As spring pushes its first fragile shoots through the soil, you feel something shift, the promise that hunger may end. Historical accounts often describe the first true harvest after a famine as nearly miraculous. Villagers spoke of kneeling in the fields, kissing the earth that offered grain again. You imagine yourself stumbling into the field, running rough fingers over tender stalks of barley, hearing the dry hiss as they sway in the breeze. The smell is sharp and grassy, but to you it is sweeter than any feast. One unusual story in parish records tells of a community that baked a single great loaf from the first flour milled after famine. dividing it so every villager received a bite. Children danced with crumbs clutched in their fists. Old men wept openly, and women blessed the oven as though it were an altar. You close your eyes and picture it, the heat of the loaf in your hands, the crust cracking, the taste flooding your mouth like sunlight. Researchers remain divided on how quickly recovery came after famine. Some argue that even after harvest, malnutrition lingered, bodies too weakened to bounce back. Others note that hope itself, combined with bread in the belly, revived people faster than expected. Whatever the truth, that first loaf became more than food. It was proof that survival had been worth it. A peculiar anecdote whispers in folklore. Villagers claimed that bread baked after famine carried a sweetness never found in ordinary years. Was it truly sweeter, or did hunger sharpen memory? Perhaps both. You take your own bite now, feeling tears sting your eyes as the warm crumb melts on your tongue. It is just bread, yet it tastes like salvation. The children laugh as they chew, their voices ringing with energy you had almost forgotten. Neighbors gather in the lane, breaking bread, trading smiles instead of rumors. For once, smoke rising from chimneys smells not of bark or weeds but of honest grain. You look around and realize how much has been lost, but also how much has endured. As night falls, you lie on your straw bed, stomach fuller than it has been in months. The famine year has scarred you, taught you things you never wished to learn: how to boil leather, how to eat worms, how to ration love itself. But it has also shown you the stubbornness of life, the way voices still rose in song, the way even crumbs could bind a village together. The fire burns brighter tonight, the air warmer, the future less cruel. You drift into sleep with bread still sweet on your tongue, whispering thanks that the year without food has finally passed. Tomorrow will bring new labor, new struggles, but not the hollow gnawing that once seemed endless. And so, the famine year closes. You've walked through barren fields and tangled forests, scavenged roots and nettles, tasted bark, snails, and bitter acorns. You've heard the hollow chants of neighbors, felt the sting of empty bowls, seen sacrifice written on the faces of the old and the young alike. Yet here, at the end, the story slows, the sharp edges softening. Imagine yourself now in a quiet meadow, the harvest long since gathered, the air filled not with hunger but with the hum of bees. The bread is warm again, resting in your palm, its crust golden, its crumbs soft. You tear a piece gently, the steam rising, carrying with it the faint sweetness of grain renewed. Each bite is slow, deliberate, not desperate. This is not survival, it is living. Let your shoulders loosen, the weight of gnawing hunger falling away. Listen for the fading echoes of songs once sung in famine. They dissolve now into silence, replaced by the whisper of grass in the breeze. Even the shadows of bark bread and boiled leather recede, leaving only lessons that resilience is stitched into human breath, that even in the bleakest year, life finds small ways to continue. You are no longer in a smoky hut, no longer scraping pots or counting crumbs. You are lying comfortably, safe and still, knowing the famine has passed. The fields are green again, the granaries are full, the fear is gone. Close your eyes to the warmth of the fire, to the soft glow of memory. Let your breath slow, steady, and calm. The hunger of history is behind you now, and only rest lies ahead. Sleep comes gently, and with it, peace. Sweet dreams.